I'm going to go ahead now with a story about Margaret Fuller's life, which I've called A Life of Greatness. And I want to start with a question. And the question, two questions. What makes a person great? What shapes the kind of person who takes action to make a difference in the world? And these are questions that I think are very relevant for us today. One of the uses of history is to provide us with role models. And the role models who inspire me the most are people who struggled against considerable odds to become great. In entering their stories, I believe we can gain insight on the challenges we face. We might even be inspired to let our own greatness show more powerfully. So, part of what fascinates me about Margaret are the questions she raises for me about my own life. Like, how do we turn the difficulties we encounter into opportunities for growth? How do we know we have something important to contribute to the world? And how do we find the courage and support to bring forth what is within us to create? Barry Andrews, author of a new book of Margaret's writings called The Spirit Leads, describes her as a religious radical, avant-garde cultural critic, feminist, progressive social theorist, investigative journalist, war correspondent, and public intellectual, and he left out educator. Now, any one or two of these would have made her an important person, but she did all of this in a short life of only 40 years. In a society where women had almost no rights, where her access to education, even to libraries, was limited, and where she had to struggle with difficult economic circumstances. On the plus side, she was born in Cambridge, into an educated but not wealthy family. In fact, she was born right here, in this house, or up over there. And I'm not sure we know what room it was. That's what I want to know. I want to know what room it was and what room she lived in. Probably maybe a couple of different ones during her life. And she lived in this house for the first 16 years of her life. Her father, Timothy Fuller, was a lawyer. In those days, most girls did not receive any education or much education. Maybe they learned to read, but not a whole lot of education beyond that. But he saw that she had real ability, and so he guided her in what became a very strict classical education. By the time she was 3 and a half, he was teaching her to read and write. And at age 4 and a half, he started teaching her arithmetic. And at 5, she began learning English and Latin grammar. So, imagine that. Her mother, Margaret Crane Fuller, taught her to appreciate the beauty of nature. And as a young girl, Margaret loved to walk in the gardens. Her mother created gardens all around this house. Of course, it was much more rural than there's a plot plan of the area upstairs by the front door. And you get a sense that this was really this was the country at that time. And later she writes about how happy she was to be among the flowers. So there was kind of a nice antidote to her father's very strict education. And he was a taskmaster, and he really wanted to challenge her. Maybe it was fortunate that when she was about 9, he was elected to the U.S. Congress, and he went to Washington. She got a little break, although he wrote her letters almost every day and was still monitoring her assignments, and she had to write back what she was reading and studying. But she did get to go to an actual school for a year. She went to the Cambridgeport Private Grammar School, which was also known as the Port School. And I understand that's where the post office is today. And this was a school that prepared boys for Harvard, but they let girls attend, which was very unusual. And then when she was 11, she was sent to Dr. Park's Boston Lyceum for Young Ladies, where she studied Italian, French, geography, and took dancing lessons. She didn't like the school very much because the other children kidded her about being her country ways. And so even for people even in those days, there was bullying. They were the city people in Boston, and at that point, Cambridge, at least the Cambridge port area, was the country. And she lived with an aunt and uncle that year because the family moved to Washington to be with the father. When they came back, they were observing, she was still studying with the father all this time, and they observed that she was really getting very knowledgeable and articulate and spoke very forcefully, and they started worrying that she would never get married. So they sent her out to Groton to Susan Prescott's Young Ladies Seminary. And tomorrow we're having a conversation in Groton at 2 o'clock. And that will focus more on what her life was like in Groton, both as a student and then later when they moved back there. But she came back, after a short time, she came back to the port school, studied Greek and Latin there, and eventually they gave up on school, and she and her father worked out a self-study program. So largely she was homeschooled, with a couple of these other forays. Fortunately, that room upstairs that you came in through was a library at the time, and fortunately he had a lot of classics and a lot of good books there. And so she had access to those books, and this self-study program she made, she basically organized all the books in the library and how she was going to get them all read. She read just about everything she could get her hands on. About that time, she was still like in her teens, she became friends with a group of young Harvard students, many of whom were preparing for ministry in the Unitarian Church. And they were studying things like German philosophy, literature, and poetry. That was the craze of the time. So she started getting interested in that as well, and she borrowed books from them and then brought them home back to this house to discuss them. And I guess they had some very lively conversations. And she became friends with some of the most prominent men who became Unitarian ministers. This house really helped shape who Margaret became. When she was in her early 30s, she wrote about something that she remembered happening to her at some point when she was growing up that helped her realize who she was. She writes, "I had stopped myself one day on the stairs and asked how I came to be here. How is it that I seem to be this Margaret Fuller? What does it mean? What shall I do about it?" On your way out, look at the stairs and imagine her saying that, because that's probably her first realization that her life had a larger meaning. When she was 16 and her father was done being in Congress and came back home, then they decided to move. He was feeling very confident as a lawyer, and they moved to a more upscale neighborhood, Dana Hill, near Harvard College. And at that point, she became friends with Eliza Farrer, who was the wife of a Harvard professor who helped Margaret improve her social skills. And at that point, Margaret began being responsible for the education of her younger brothers. And then, when she was in her 20s, the family moved to Groton. That was way out in the country. And she was not happy about this, but being an unmarried woman, she had to go with them. And she was also the primary teacher of the rest of the family. But she eventually came to appreciate what the time in Groton meant. And as I said, I'll talk more about that tomorrow. She also began, a couple things happened during that time that I'll mention. She began to be paid for teaching by children other than those in her family. She didn't get paid for teaching her family, but other children in the neighborhood came. So that sort of launched her career as a teacher.